Dr. Kerry Spackman, thank you very much for joining us.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, appreciate your time. And I mean, you've done so much in your life, from neuroscience to engineering to electronics to writing a best-selling book to producing a movie that's coming out soon to engineering, and won so many prizes along the way. So how did you get into all of this in the first place?
Well, it's been an interesting journey, that's for sure, and not much of it was actually planned. So it seemed that most sort of things led on to the other. So when I was in electronics, I was at Ford Motor Company in world headquarters, developing electronics there for them. From there I met Jackie Stewart, three-time world champion, who was in Formula One obviously. So from there I went into Formula One, and we started to look at the driver, and nobody really seemed to know what went on inside a driver's brain from a purely computational point of view. So I decided to do a PhD in that. And that led me into all sorts of things. And then while I was working with one of the Formula One teams on their simulator, helping develop their simulator, I was working with one of their Formula One drivers, and he said he was having some trouble, psychological trouble as it were, and could I help? He said he read every self-help book there was and they didn't work. And I said, well look, I don't know so much about it, but like everything else, I've done my homework in maths and electronics and various other things. I'll apply the same approach. And out of that I developed a program for him, which he found really helpful. And he said, you know, you have to write that down, you have to make it into a book. So it kind of happened by accident.
Yeah, and then the Winner's Bible ended up being a bestseller book. So did you expect that when you started out?
Of course, you never know.
Yeah,
I was very lucky to get good publicity, and a lot of successful people endorsed the book because it worked for them. And in fact, one day I was driving through London and I got a phone call from this Formula One driver, and he said, "Oh, hey Kerry, how you doing?" And I said, "Very well." And he said, "Look, I just want to tell you, I've used the Winner's Bible every day for an entire year.
Wow. This
is my 1 year." Okay. And of course he was the guy that said self-help books just don't work. So that was a good result. So I knew we were onto something there.
Fantastic. And Oompher as a website is all about inspiring people to achieve extraordinary things. So who and what, I guess, during your life and career has inspired you along the way?
I think it's been a variety of people. There's not one specific person. I mean, I mentioned Jackie Stewart before. He is an extremely extraordinary individual. Everything he goes about life is based on, you know, good morals, good ethics, a relentless attention to detail, and he's highly professional. So he's a really, really good guy. Yeah. But there's been a variety of people.
Yeah, and I guess some of the other people you've worked with, from the All Blacks to, as you say, Formula One drivers to Hollywood actresses and actors to even people who have had drug addictions and getting them back on track, that must be pretty humbling and inspiring as well.
Yes, I think, you know, one never knows the outcome of one's book. You just do the best you can and you put it out there. But I think the most important thing for me, even more important than the sales, was I got an email from a guy in Australia who had come to New Zealand to commit suicide. And he bought a one-way ticket here, and he'd heard that Queenstown was a great place and he wanted to die in beautiful nature. And he got off the plane with nothing, and he saw my little book. And he thought, a winner's Bible, I wonder what a winner does, because I'm a loser. And he bought the book, and he sat down and read it cover to cover that day, and he ended up going back to Australia, and he didn't commit suicide, obviously, because he wrote me the letter, and he just told me that it's now almost 2 years later, and he's now married, and his business is doing extremely well. So for me, that's the more important than the sales volume, that one person's life, and I don't know all the other people, but so that really worked for him. And that's
incredible.
That's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as a cognitive neuroscientist, can you just explain briefly, I guess, what that entails and what it all involves?
Yeah, so for me, what I was focusing on was how the brain constructs the perception of motion. So I was very interested in race car drivers and professional test drivers. I've done some work with Ford Motor Company's world headquarters and their professional test drivers, and we wanted to make them better, and the question was nobody really knew how to do that. So I went to NASA to see how they trained the astronauts, went to the RAF to see how they trained their Top Gun pilots at the aeromedical facility. And again, that's part of doing the homework, you know, don't just launch into something. So homework's really important. So every time I've moved disciplines, do big homework, I mean, really at a high level. And then, so the question was, well, how does the brain construct this perception of motion? It's got all sorts of inputs from vision, from the vestibular sense, which is your, sort of like your gyros in your head. And if I can understand that, then I can maybe optimize that as a control system for a race driver. So that's what I was involved in.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess over your career that's involved so much, as we talked about before, you've met so many high-achieving individuals in so many fields. So what is some consistent things that the most high-achieving people do differently?
Yeah, so high achievers, you say, what is the difference between a high achiever and a low achiever? It's very obvious, and people don't like this answer. They just work harder than everybody else. They really, really, really work hard. I mean, really work hard, and most people have no concept. They have a relentless attention to detail, not just the broad things or the medium things, but the absolute little minutiae. They're constantly looking for improvement. They never give in. These are easy things to say, relentless attention to detail, never give in. And of course the question is, how does a normal person get that level of robustness and strength? But they are quite different. But I think that is a learnable skill. Some people are just naturally robust. Some people are naturally attention to detail, obsessively attentive to detail. But you can learn those skills.
And then there's some other things as well, I guess, more finer things if you think about people, if there's two people together who both work incredibly hard, but one's maybe remarkably successful than the other, is there often some mindset things and things like that which can really help you in terms of going about your life and career?
Yes, I think success is a complicated, multifactorial thing. It's not just attention to detail, it's not just effort, because a lot of people do work hard and become successful. I mentioned one, doing your homework really well. I think being able to assess the risks, the downsides, and all those sorts of things are very, very important. And I think, depend on your field of expertise and your discipline. There's not one. See, I'm a real fan that there's not one size fits all. Tiger Woods may be a brilliant golfer, but he may make an absolutely lousy businessman. He doesn't, he's very wealthy, but he may do. So I think the skills that you need in the tool set, it's all about tools in your toolbox. What tools do you need to be successful given your personality, which is unique to you? So you have a unique personality, I have a unique personality, I have unique weaknesses and strengths. So understanding all those, I think most self-help books have this really broad brush approach, be motivated, work hard, blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't really work for the individual. You really need to get to understand you. What is your skill set? What are your strengths and weaknesses?
Okay. So from having worked with the huge variety of people we've mentioned, from sports teams to Hollywood actresses and actors to Formula One drivers and everything like that, how do you actually go about rewiring the brain? Does it come down to those tools that you've just been talking about?
Yes, I have an approach that I use which I find quite easy, and I call that the 4 pillars. And a person is made up of 4 conceptual pillars. At the bottom level is your physiology, your nuts and bolts, how your brain is wired. And everyone's brain is wired differently.
Okay.
On top of that is kind of like the psychology, the software that runs on the brain. So you imagine like a computer with a hardware chip, and you imagine the software that talks to that. And it's the same in a human. You have your hardware and you have your software, as it were. Attached to the software is all your history, everything you've been through. Your history influences your thoughts that you run through your head. But what's really interesting about a human is that your thoughts actually rewire your brain. If you think certain things over and over again, the brain will actually change. Its structure and how it works will change. And so there's a really sharp feedback loop. So you can have one small event in history which could affect how you perceive yourself or the universe. That can then cascade around in circles and be almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then at the very top you have your philosophy, your kind of view on the world. So the 4 pillars, your philosophy, your psychology, your physiology and your history, they all interact with each other. And so when I'm working with anybody, I want to know what's in those 4 pillars. Your brain is wired differently to mine. Your psychology is differently to mine. Your history is differently to mine. And how do all those things impact each other? And what's really important is that there's such a powerful feedback loop. So you can make a small change somewhere and it will cascade and go round and around and make a profound difference to somebody. So the key is what is in those boxes and which are the most important ones to fix or adjust.
Okay, and it's the change that you make with the different people, no matter what their background, does it all come down to understanding them as a person, as you say, their history and everything, and then rewiring from there?
Absolutely, it's all about the individual. So the first thing to do is to actually understand what's in those boxes. And so with the book, what I try to do is give them tools to look inside those boxes, inside those 4 pillars, to see who they are and how they can help themselves. And that's why I think the book has been successful.
Yeah, and when we talk about, I guess, some really high-level people in terms of winners, as the book's all about, are winners created, or are they born, or is it something that people develop? Or
I think it's a combination. I think some people are naturally predisposed to certain ways of going about life, and that's great, and those ways are often rewarded. However, I think there are people who have overcome enormous inbuilt difficulties to become extremely successful. So it's a combination of both.
Okay, and still talking about the Winner's Bible, I mean, as we've been talking about, it is really scientific in the way that it's all written and so on, and the change that people can make. So is that what makes it different than all the other self-help books out there? Obviously we've got guys like motivational trainers over the world, Tony Robbins, Brendan Burchard, people like that. So is your one quite different because it's so scientific?
I think the main difference is that I've found, well, for example, if you work with top people, they are motivated. My Formula One driver was highly motivated. He didn't need to be rah-rahed up. And secondly, I think motivation is great, but it's kind of like a short-term thing. I can get you all fired up and motivated to do this, but what happens 6 months later when your business is still losing money and you haven't got that breakthrough and you're just battling ahead? It's really hard to keep motivating. So what you need are tools to make yourself have a really solid platform on which you can be successful. Okay. So I'm really about tools.
Yeah, and those tools in particular, I mean, if you had to summarise 2 or 3 of them that people can implement into their lives who are watching this now, what would you say?
Well, I think it's like a surgeon. What tool does he use? He has a whole range of tools: a scalpel, whatever, etc. So I think the Winner's Bible, starts off with that kind of 4 pillars platform, and says, now what do we do to go inside each of those, and how do we fix them? And there's no short answer to that.
Okay. And in your role as a neuroscientist, what's some of the things or the discoveries or the research that you've worked out that surprised you and surprised other people today?
Well, one of them that was really interesting was when I was working with professional test drivers, and we tried to work out what made Sir Jackie Stewart so much better than everybody else. I think everyone said, well, okay, he's world champion in driving. He's probably got better reflexes than everybody else. And so we did a whole battery of tests that the US Air Force used and so on. And it turned out that his reflexes weren't extraordinary, but he had an absolutely extraordinary memory for motion. And because he could remember everything really well, so you go around a corner, he would remember 100 little things that happened on the corner. Literally, within half a second of the car moving, he could tell you literally 100 things that were going on. The bushing did this, and the rear suspension rocker arm did that. And you go, oh, you can't remember all that. That's impossible. But you look at the telemetry, it was all there. So because he had this fantastic memory for motion, every time he went around a lap, he could remember all the things that he did and all the outcomes. Then he'd go around and do another lap and look at all the different things and look at the inputs and the outputs and compare them. Whereas you or I go around a corner, we remember 2 things, like, wow, we missed the apex, So he had a much richer tool set to play with because he had this good memory for motion. So that was unexpected. But we discovered that ourselves.
And when you're working with people like that, I guess everyone has individual talents. Is your advice to people usually to really sort of forget everything that you're not good at and just focus down on the things that you're really good at?
I think one of the most important things is to be realistic about your own abilities. That's number one. So, I may really want to be heavyweight champion of the world, but it's just not going to happen. If I stand next to Lennox Lewis, it's just no amount of motivation, no amount of wanting it's going to happen. So you've got to take stock of actually who you are and what your resources are. Then you've got to look at what your passions are. Because if you're passionate about something, that's a pretty strong engine that will get you through a lot of things. And then you've got to go about really methodically about what are all the tools I need, what are my risks, and all those sorts of things. So approach it almost like a business approach. I know that sounds very clinical, but you know, passion is the emotional part of it.
Okay. And when people are going up and down sort of a few times a month on a sort of emotional roller coaster, I think everyone in life does that, whether they're in business or in sport or whatever. How do you balance that? That's one of the questions that I hear so many people ask, but is there a way to just to tell yourself and just to keep going straight and not really get into downs? And
humans are emotional, so we are allowed to have ups and downs.
Yeah.
That's okay. We're not just machines that carry on. The question is, how can we ride those waves so that we get the most out of them, and how can we make the lows not so low and the highs realistic? And I think again, it all comes down to, well, what is driving you up and down? If your external circumstances are so powerful and your own internal control is so low, it's like the gain on a controlling system. If you think about electronics, you know, if you have a small input and there's a suddenly massive output, that's an unstable system. And so a lot of humans, a lot of people are quite unstable in the small events, can have a catastrophic impact on their behaviour. And what you want to be able to do is say, well, actually, you are a human being and you are going somewhere, and sure, the environment on the outside has to impact you because you need to be able to change to it. But what you don't want to be doing is reactively changing to every little bump in the wave. You want the boat to be able to carry along, to ride the waves, but you don't want it to be thrown off course. So again, there's tools on how do you change your internal balance, how do you change your stability, and how do you make sure that you interpret external events correctly.
Okay, brilliant. And just before we head into our quick fire questions, what's next for you, Dr. Kerry Spackman?
Well, my movie, Einstein's Compass, that's a really big deal.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, yes, I mean, Albert Einstein, everybody's heard of him. And Time magazine at the end of the millennium was unanimous. He was the most important person in the entire 21st century. So he's an amazing guy in so many different areas, and yet there's never been a proper movie about him. There's been documentaries, of course, and at one stage there were over 1,000 books about him. But I've been passionate about what he's done, and he's just an extraordinary individual. So this is a wonderful movie with absolutely fantastic characters. We've got the original Dr. Evil, in the movie, who comes up against Einstein, and we've got wonderful characters, and this is all true. It's all true. I mean, these characters. So it's not a science story. It's a really human story of a heroic journey to the heavens against impossible odds, and Einstein comes back, and everything we have today, every DVD player, every cell phone, all came from him. Effectively.
And where's it being produced and filmed and so on?
Well, we've got it funded privately, which is extremely unusual for a large, big sort of Hollywood-style blockbuster, and that's been done out of New Zealand. And we have a absolute A-list director, which I can't tell you about yet, but we'll announce that early next year. So it's going to be an absolute top of the line movie, and I'm hoping to have as much of it based here in New Zealand. The film will be obviously filmed in Berlin, where it's set, but post-production and things will be done here in New Zealand. Okay,
fantastic. So just a few quick fire questions to finish now. What's your vision for your work, and I guess your dreams still to come?
Well, I think I go very much along Einstein's own words: try not to be a success, but try to be a man of value.
Okay.
So brilliant. Can you be of value?
Yeah, brilliant. And what are we're just talking about, I guess, things that successful people do differently. If you had to sum that up into sort of three things that you would say that you've noticed, how would you sum that up?
Three things. They're smarter at how to go about life. They are smarter. They work harder and more persistent, and they have more attention to detail.
Okay. And if you could go back to the start of your career and give yourself a bit of advice, is there anything that you think of now that would have helped you along the way?
Well, if I went back to the beginning of my career, I would certainly be very surprised where I've ended up. I think that's really unexpected. And I think the thing that I would say to myself is really just do your homework really well. I know that sounds kind of boring, but the more you do your homework, the more you understand the background of everything, the better you will be at everything. So just take time.
Okay, so I guess the 16-year-old boy you were would be pretty proud of the man you've become today.
I'd be surprised, and I'd be very happy.
Okay, brilliant. And Dr. Kerry Spackman, you've achieved many remarkable things during your life, and many of the awards you've been recognised, such as in 2009 for the Key World Class Award for Creative Thinking, and you've released best-selling books, you've done so many amazing things. So, and we get the feeling that it's just getting started with this fantastic movie that's come out. So to finish off, can you please look down this camera here and tell us, what are your wise words for the people of New Zealand?
Well, we have a lovely country here, and I think the main thing I would like to say is that we should have a big view of our country. I think a lot of our thinking is compartmentalised. A person will think about a small part of New Zealand and someone else will think about another small part. But how do we put it all together in one big overarching view? And I think we tend to miss that in New Zealand. We're a young country, we've only been around a couple of 100 years. And when you go back to some of the countries up in Europe that have been around for thousands of years, you see the bigger sweep of history, you see the bigger view of mankind. And I think if we in New Zealand could have that bigger, longer term view, not thinking 50 years ahead or 100 years ahead, but maybe 500 years ahead, make our decisions based on that, then I think we'll do very well.
That's Kerry Spackman, thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Thanks for your time, guys.